Thanks so much, Juliet. Really awesome to be here. I know what you've been doing over the last few years, and I'm so glad that finally we have found a time where I can come on stage. And hi, everyone. Great to see you here tonight. As Juliet mentioned, this is a stage that is most often filled by climate founders. But I guess a little bit different to what other founders might say is actually tonight, I want to talk about why we might actually want to slow down the transition towards renewable energy. Obviously, also as a climate founder, I have to start this talk with a reference to Tesla, the mastermind of the EV transition. But actually, when I look at Tesla and I look at Tesla's products, really what I see is that they have these insane supply chains. And so what do I really mean by this? Well, I want to start with a question for all of you. How many suppliers do you think Tesla has in all its products? I'm going to give you 3 options. I'm guessing some of you have read the annual report. I've already seen one here that's shouting out numbers, which mean you might know the answer. Option 1, 873. Option 2, 4,898. Option 3, 13,428. So if you think it's option 1, I want you to do this for 2, and this for 3. In 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, it was a pretty easy question. Almost everyone got 3. I guess that's also the point of my talk. So what do we actually mean by that? Well, this is a very, very simple map of what goes into a battery. Here you can see 4 stages. Really, there's a lot more than that. In each of these stages, you have multiple different components. And in each of these components, you can have anything from tens to hundreds of suppliers sitting behind it, for example, for something like copper. And so this is what creates all that complexity and brings us up to that 13,000, just for Tesla. What this means at scale is that you have tons of raw material going into the energy transition. To be specific, by 2050, we expect there's going to be about 6.5 billion tons of raw material going into the energy transition. So in London talk, by weight, that means about the equivalent of 500 million TfL red buses. And so when we look at these supply chains and we realize, yes, these are very complex and we're going to have to do a lot of shifting around to get ready for the energy transition. The other thing that I look at is these supply chains are also coming from exceptionally high-risk regions. For example, we've got lithium. 70% of lithium is refined in China, which has huge connections to local community impacts, human rights abuses such as forced labor. Then we've got cobalt. 70% of cobalt is coming from one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. 20 to 30% of that is mined in what we call small-scale mining, which really means simple tools like this picture, and children, for example, 3 years old, sometimes doing it. And then we've got nickel. By 2040, we think there's going to be about 80% of nickel just coming from Indonesia. And this year, so far, we've seen over 100,000 football pitches worth of deforestation in nickel in Indonesia alone. And then we think, oh, maybe this is a small problem. Actually, no. 75% of batteries are connected to forced labor or other human rights abuses, according to our supply chain data at Infyos. This isn't just a small problem that only affects 1 or 2 companies. Really, almost every company that we look at is somehow exposed. Why does this matter? Well, I'm guessing most of us are in this room because we care about climate change. We want to make sure that we transition towards clean energy. But really, at what cost? Do we really want to move as quickly as possible away from fossil fuels and perhaps repeat some of the major mistakes that fossil fuels have made in human rights and environmental catastrophes around the world? Or do we want to look at what the other options are out there? To break it down, here's 3 options. Option 1, bury our head in the sand and just keep going straight as we are right now. Option 2, cancel the whole thing, bury our head in the sand and say, actually, let's not do this at all. Let's listen to the fossil fuel companies who tell us this is a terrible idea. Or option number 3, we accept that there are some trade-offs we have to make. that there are some major impacts happening in these supply chains that we really wish weren't there, we try to understand it as much as we possibly can of what's really going on in the supply chains. And then, importantly, we actually do something about it. Obviously, I'm a startup founder, so I have to be optimistic and say we can change. But I actually genuinely do believe that. I actually don't just believe that for me. I actually think every single one of us in this room has some ability to have an impact on this. Let me break it down. So for me, at Infyos, I used to live in China. I worked in Chinese supply chains. I speak Chinese. 70% of the world's renewable energy manufacturing happens in China. It kind of made sense when I met my co-founder, Tony, and we started building out this team, that we should probably work with the biggest companies in the world, most of which are in China, to solve this problem. But for everyone else in the room that isn't in that weird set of circumstances, if you work in government and policy, one of the interesting things we see happening in this space is this huge increase in regulation around supply chains and ESG, particularly in Europe. You have things like the EU Battery Regulation, Conflict Minerals Act, Forced Labour Acts, and more and more and more. So that's great in Europe. To be honest, in the UK, we're nowhere near that. For energy and mobility companies or people that are working with these companies, what we see is a huge variation in terms of how much companies are doing to solve these challenges. And therefore, if you're working in these companies, really try to understand, are you in a company that's in option 1, 2, or 3? And how do you move it as much as possible to option 3? And then finally, for actually every single person in this room, I assume all of you have mobile phones in your pockets that have lithium-ion batteries in them. Some of you might be like me and ride Lime bikes far too often that also have lithium-ion batteries in them. And also, all of you need some form of energy at home, might be buying a renewable tariff, and that's connected to these renewable energy supply chains. So for each and every one of you, you are connected to this impact that I've talked about today. And so hopefully this has helped you understand a little bit more about what that is. My ask for you is to think about what's the small action that you could take in the next 24 hours, or actually even tonight, to do something about that. For example, it can be as simple as figure out the email address for your energy company or the Twitter account and ping them a message, say, hey, I realize you guys have forced labor in your supply chain. What are you doing about it? See how they respond. They might do nothing. They probably will do nothing. But some of them might respond. And it's interesting to see how they respond. So also please tell me how they respond. It's very interesting. So finally, to finish, what I really believe is that if we do not speak up and we do not do something about this, nothing will change. And so once we go into all these fun discussions that Juliet is so good at organizing, I think there's one question that I'd love for you to discuss a bit more. It is, what can I as an individual do to not just make sure this energy transition happens as quickly as possible, but also to make sure it happens as sustainably as possible. Not just for everyone sitting in this room or actually standing in this room, but for everybody that exists across the supply chain.